This year, we are honored to have the 2015 Fred Korematsu Day presentation here at Troy High. My name is Ramo Ronconi, and I'm your principal. And prior to starting today's event, I wanted to introduce some of the people that have been able to be here today as special guests. In front, this area right here, and the people on stage will be introduced at a later time in the program. But Mrs. Jen Hilsinger, she is the co-facilitator for the Troy School District Diversity and Inclusion Council. She'll be with us momentarily. And Mr. Roland Huang, the Commissioner of the Michigan Asian Pacific American Affairs Commission, as well as an adjunct instructor at the Department of American Culture at the University of Michigan, is here on stage with me. Those two individuals were key in putting this program today, so if we can give them a round of applause. Also here today is Mr. Jamie Su, the chair of the Michigan Asian Pacific American Affairs Commission. Mr. Dan Slater, the mayor of the city of Troy. Mrs. Lori Bloom, the city attorney. And city council members, Mr. Dave Henderson and Mrs. Ellen Porter. Also, the Honorable Judge Kirsten Harding from the 52nd District Court. Mrs. Cindy Stewart, the Troy Community Affairs Director. And members of the Racial Equity Initiative, Teresa Tran, Mona Belsari, and Aziz Kanker. And from our district central office, Dr. Richard Macheski, our superintendent. Mr. Mark Dajak, assistant superintendent and former principal of Troy High School. Welcome back, Mr. Dajak. And Mrs. Carrie Birmingham, Director of Community Relations for the district. Also want to welcome all the staff and students from Athens High School, Niles High School, and from Troy High School. And also we have other guests here from the community. So thank you all for coming today. Now I'm going to turn over the program to Mr. Dan House, Assistant Principal, and he's going to coordinate the next part of the program. Thank you for coming today.
Welcome, everyone. It is an honor to celebrate this great man's lifetime fight for civil rights of people. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which confiscated all possessions and property from Japanese Americans and then placed them in internment camps, which were mainly in the southwest part of the United States. Fred Korematsu, quote unquote, was an ordinary person who took an extraordinary stand. He did this by refusing to go to the government internment camps. He fought against this discrimination, as well as fought to overturn his conviction under Roosevelt's executive order. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in the case Korematsu versus the United States in 1944. His zeal for fighting for his freedom and the freedom of others is exemplary, and he was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Bill Clinton in 1988. This award is the United States' highest civilian honor. Greater detail about this outstanding American's life and fight for freedom will be presented further in this program. Again, we would like to welcome you to the presentation and also encourage you to learn about how one individual can really make a difference by being courageous and standing up for what they believe in. Next, we would like to invite up our first speaker to present the Fred Korematsu Certificate of Recognition. Please welcome Michigan Civil Rights Director, Mr. Matthew Wiesaw.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to everyone who had a part in putting this together. and especially thank you all to you for being here. I don't know if you're aware of this story or not, but this is a tremendous story, and I would just strongly, strongly encourage you to pay particular attention because there is a strong message here. You know, one of the things, most of you are probably familiar with the name Jim Valvano. He was the great basketball coach for South Carolina, died of cancer, who died with the motto, never give up, don't ever give up. And I think that's one of the themes that you will hear and see here through the battle that Mr. Korematsu went through. With that, on behalf of the governor of the great state of Michigan, I would like to read this special tribute. I will probably violate some of the rules of public speaking, but the governor was not aware that I wear glasses, and this is small print, so I'm going to be holding this up a little closer. On behalf of the people of Michigan, I, Rick Snyder, Governor of Michigan, do hereby pay special tribute to Fred Korematsu. Whereas the state of Michigan is pleased to join the Michigan Asian Pacific Advisory Affairs Commission in recognizing the late Korematsu, and where Fred T. Korematsu was born in Oakland, California on January 30th, 1919, as the third of 4 sons to a Japanese immigrant parents, he was one of many American citizens of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast during World War II. And whereas following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an executive order authorizing the U.S. military to require all American Japanese ancestries be placed in internment camps. And whereas Fred Korematsu is famously known for his arrest at the age of 23 on May 30th, 1942, and conviction on September 8th, 1942, for defying the government's order to be moved to an internment camp. He appealed his case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in the December 1944 landmark decision, Korematsu versus United States, the High Court ruled against him. And whereas nearly 40 years later, on November 10th, 1983, Fred Korematsu's conviction was formally vacated in the U.S. District Court of Northern California, an action considered to be a pivotal moment in the civil rights history throughout the rest of his life. Throughout the rest of his life, Fred Korematsu remained an activist and received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1998, the nation's highest civilian honor. Now therefore, I, Rick Snyder, Governor of Michigan, pay special tribute to the legacy of Fred Korematsu and join with the Michigan Asian Pacific American Affairs Commission as they honor and recognize his many contributions to America's civil rights movement.
Thank you, Mr. Wiesa. Next, please welcome the Commissioner of Michigan's Asian Pacific American Affairs Commission to give us some background and history of Fred Korematsu days around the country. Please welcome Mr. Roland Huang.
Thank you. On behalf of the chair of the Michigan Asian Pacific American Affairs Commission, Jamie Sue, and the rest of the commission, welcome. Fred Korematsu was a welder. He was the son of a floral business owner. And yet, his place in history is legendary because he stood up for his rights, for freedom, and fought the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. He simply did not want to go to a detention center. And for this, we honor him today. You are a witness to a movement. In Michigan, we have the Certificate of Recognition recognizing Fred Korematsu. But there's a movement going on, and you are a witness to that. California, Hawaii, Utah, Illinois, and Georgia all have a formal Fred Korematsu Day. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights has recommended to the President and to Congress that there be a national Fred Korematsu Day. I really want to relate the personal nature of Fred's connection to Michigan. After the internment, he moved to Detroit and married his wife, Catherine, and lived for a while in Detroit. And it is here at the University of Michigan that he was a member of the class. He was on the phone talking about internment year after year until he died back in 2006. Now you're going to watch a video about Fred Korematsu in World War II. Pay close attention to the hysteria of the time and think about how some of the issues of the time now can be related to the hysteria that is going on against certain peoples here, and how the vigilance to protect civil rights is not an issue that goes away. It's something that we have to remember. And with that, we recognize Fred Korematsu's fight for freedom, for himself, for the Japanese community, Japanese American community, but ultimately for all of us. Thank you.
We expect the worst to happen, and it did. Curfew notices were posted on the telephone poles. And then after that, about a week or so, the notice for the evacuation.
I didn't think that the government would go as far as to include American citizens to be interned without a hearing. And then later on, they changed my draft card to 4C, which is enemy alien. In those days, if you're an Asian, people automatically think you don't belong in this country. You're not an American. And I thought that was wrong. December 7th, it was Sunday. My girlfriend and I were up on Skyline Boulevard looking down the Bay Area of the cities. At that time, I was going around with a Caucasian girlfriend. And we had spread out the Sunday magazine. Just relaxed, and it had the music on, car radio. Sunday, nice sunny day. And of course, we were talking mush. And, and all of a sudden, it stopped. And they announced that Pearl Harbor was attacked. There had been so much friction between the United States and Japan, and the way Japan was so active going into China and doing all that, invasion and so forth, that I had a feeling that, they're just crazy enough to come down here. And that's what they did. At the nursery, my parents, they were all around the radio listening. They weren't saying very much. My mother was crying, my father was just disgusted. All that work that my parents did to that nursery and so forth, what's going to happen?
There were a lot of organizations that wanted internment, the agricultural interests in California, for example, because Japanese Americans had been so successful as farmers and competitors.
So when Pearl Harbor hit, now they could say it was, quote, military necessity, and therefore they could wholesalely exclude persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. There were a lot of persons, agricultural persons to media persons, who were whipping up anti-Japanese sentiments.
General DeWitt, who was lieutenant general, is about as high as they get, was the general in charge of the West Coast. There was some feeling that the West Coast might be invaded. He had recommended that the Japanese Americans be excluded from the West Coast so that they couldn't give secret tips to the invaders if the invaders ever came. That was sheer baloney, because there is no instance ever discovered in which any Japanese American on the West Coast ever did anything disloyal. It was pure foolishness.
Colonel Ben Detson, who was a government lawyer, wrote all of the arguments for the internment that General DeWitt presented to the War Department. Ben Detson simply said that because Japanese Americans belonged to an enemy race, their internment could be justified.
You see, before the war, my parents were very proud people. They always talked about Japan, you know, and also about the samurais and stuff like that. And right after Pearl Harbor, everything just, you know, they were just real quiet. They kept it to themselves. They were afraid to talk about that.
The Secret Service and the FBI had swept into the Japanese American community and had arrested any community leader, any teacher, any civic organization head of any importance in that community.
I thought the exclusion order would be only for aliens and those that are born in Japan. I didn't think that the government would go as far as to include American citizens. Well, I knew I couldn't take my girlfriend with me, so I decided maybe we should try to sneak out to Nevada to get away from this. And then one day my girlfriend wanted to meet me. I was waiting for her at the corner, and she didn't show up. I ran out of cigarettes. So like a darn fool, I went across the street to the drugstore, and someone recognized me, I assumed, because when I came back and I was standing there for another 5 minutes, then the police came. And they looked around and looked at me and said, "Did you see any short Japanese person around here, Asian?" I said, "No." He looked at me and says, "Well, let me see your identification." By that time, the 2 MPs came in the military. And he says, "We have to take you to the city hall." After I was arrested, I never did see my girlfriend again. When the MPs took me to a separate room, well, it was a horse stall, and it was way out on the other side of the racetrack. And they took me there in a pickup. But it was a big door for the let horses in. There's a gap about 12 inches down below. There's no floor, it's just dirt. So the wind was blowing through there, and there's cracks all around the wall. And there's a light bulb up there, one light bulb on the ceiling, and that was it. And I went there and I lied on the cot and I said, "Gee, jail was a lot better than this."
After we got to Topaz, Utah, people realized who Fred was. He felt very lonely there at Topaz. He was working digging ditches. They were building a hospital, and the crew was very cold to him. Some people had this terrible feeling that Fred thought he was different than the rest of us Japanese Americans, and so they sort of shunned him.
I believe in principles. And certainly I believe that all persons, without distinction, are entitled to the support of the Constitution. We tried to find a legal challenge to the internment, but of course, in order to do that, you have to have a test case. You have to find somebody who is willing to have his case carried through the courts up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So we were on the lookout to find a case of that kind. It wasn't easy until I heard of Fred Korematsu's case.
The real significance of Fred's case is that it raised, for the first time, the central issue. Was the internment itself constitutional?
Our case depended on the U.S. Supreme Court. We recognized that at the outset because they would recognize there's no basis legally for this discrimination. It's a denial of due process of law.
It's part of the obligation of attorneys who present cases before the Supreme Court, and supremely so of government attorneys, the Solicitor General, that they have to be candid and honest with the court so that the Supreme Court can decide these matters of public policy on the basis of a well-developed record of all the relevant facts. And one of the tragedies of the Korematsu case was that that didn't happen.
The government had two basic arguments. One was that as a matter of military necessity, that is, the prevention of espionage and sabotage, the evacuation was required. The other was that it was limited to Japanese Americans because their racial characteristics, what one of the government lawyers said, they belong to an enemy race, was a flat-out racist argument.
Race was not really an issue apart from slavery until the Civil War. Then we have the 14th Amendment, which guarantees to every citizen equal protection of the laws. But the court rapidly retreated from that jurisprudence so that by the 1890s, we have a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, which allows separate but equal, right? Separate but equal drinking fountains, separate but equal places on the bus. And that's the state of the law at the time of Korematsu. The country was rife with racial prejudice, and the Constitution did not do much to prevent it.
I think really the Supreme Court deserves to be criticized in these cases. You read the transcripts of the arguments, the justices are not saying, where's the evidence to support General DeWitt's charges? They're simply going along, and I think one reason for that is that some members of the court, I would say Justice Frankfurter in particular, felt that it was their patriotic duty to support the president in this case without regard to the Constitution.
Well, I think the Korematsu case illustrates a number of important things for our society. One is that the courts failed us at an important time and an important juncture, as did a number of our very great leaders, because after all, it was President Roosevelt, who signed the executive order that interned the Japanese in California and throughout the western United States.
Over the years, this branch has handled at least 8 cases in the U.S. Supreme Courts. We lost one case. And the shocking thing is that we lost a case of racial discrimination against Japanese. That's a shocking thing.
I was dumbfounded what happened. But I continued on. I said, I'm an American, and just as long as I'm in this country, that I'm going to keep on going. And if there is a chance of reopening the case, I will do it.
I met Fred after his Supreme Court case had been decided, and later we married and eventually moved to California to live. When our daughter Karen was, I believe, she's a junior in high school, she came home from one afternoon and said that in her social studies class, her friend Maya had given a report about the Japanese concentration camps, Japanese American concentration camps, and that they mentioned a Korematsu case, and she said, what is this all about? And I said, well, that's your father.
Well, you know, why did you never tell me about this? I mean, why wasn't anything ever talked about my father in this regard? I couldn't believe it. I was really upset. And she said basically that it was something that, it was a subject that my father chose not to discuss.
He was quite aware that he had a criminal record, and he did experience discrimination when he applied for employment.
He felt responsible for the internment in a sort of backhanded way because his case had been lost in the Supreme Court.
He always wanted to reopen his case, but we didn't know how to do that.
The internment of Japanese Americans was a fait accompli. By 1944, people had already lost their property, 110,000 people. Some were now homeless. Some had lost their lives. Their whole structure and community was now broken. At that point, do you admit the wrongdoing and say, we're sorry, or do you cover it up? And in 1944, they chose to cover it up.
It was the opportunity to go back and recreate history, a history that had a personal impact on my family, on a whole population of people, that had a major impact on the civil rights laws.
Korematsu versus the United States was a civil rights disaster. So to be able to reopen that case, to be able to vindicate our families, and to rewrite the books on this was a real opportunity.
What I did not expect to find was literally on the top of the first file, a document from one of the Justice Department lawyers to the Solicitor General of the United States saying, we are telling lies to the Supreme Court. We have an obligation to tell the truth to the court.
The lawyers on the legal team were mainly Japanese American and very young lawyers, very idealistic young attorneys. And the question was, if you're going to reopen these monumental Supreme Court cases, do you know what you're doing? And I think there was a sense in the community that these lawyers better not lose Korematsu versus the United States for a second time. The question was, how was the government going to refute these admissions of wrongdoing and cover-up and suppression being made by the government's own lawyers?
I really think they were adrift in the Department of Justice, and this is what we had heard. There were hawks and there were doves. There were people who wanted to just give in to the petition, and there were people who wanted to fight the petition. As a result, they could not come to a coherent position. So, as they are wont to do at times of confusion, they just decided on a strategy of delay.
And after a period of 2 or 3 months with no response, the government then approached lead counsel Dale Manami and said, well, what about a pardon? Do you think Fred Korematsu would accept a pardon?
Well, of course, a pardon has a certain connotation to it, that you did something that was wrong, but your government is willing to forgive you for it.
And we brought it to Fred and Catherine, and her feeling was, it's Fred's position that the government should seek a pardon from him.
I concluded after looking at all of the facts that they had done something tantamount to confessing error. And when the government does in fact come in and confess error, even though they don't say in those magic incantation words, we confess error, they had done substantially the same thing.
We went into the courtroom the next day. The judge outlined the posture of the case. I spoke, Victor Stone spoke, Fred Korematsu spoke, and she rendered her decision then, all in one day.
We knew in advance that there was going to be a fairly large number of people in attendance, and so we did agree to open up the ceremonial courtroom, which is a much larger courtroom, and the place was packed.
A lot of these people had been in the camps. A lot of these people had not seen each other for 40 years. There was a lot of excitement in the courtroom.
Mr. Stone didn't want the court to make any kind of findings of fact, any kind of conclusions about what had happened some 40 years ago. So he pleaded to the court not to make any findings, that this is a case 40 years ago. Let's just let bygones be bygones. You know, these wounds need healing.
And Dale Manami, when he addressed the court, said, well, whose feelings are we talking about? Are we talking about the wounds of Japanese Americans who've already been in prison, who've already suffered the losses, who've already suffered the indignity and the humiliation of being in prison? Or are we talking about the reputations of government authorities who, in essence, lied to the Supreme Court, as demonstrated by the government's own documents?
And after Dale finished, Fred made what I think was a very powerful, very simple, direct appeal. He said, 40 years ago, I came into this courtroom in handcuffs, and I was sent to a camp. He said, the camp was not fit for human habitation. Horse stalls are for horses, not for people.
And then went on to entreat the court to overturn his conviction, saying that what happened to him could happen to any American citizen who looks different or who comes from a different country. and that it was important for this court to understand that the relief given to him was not just for him personally, but for, in a sense, the benefit of the whole country.
And as soon as he'd ended, and as soon as the argument was over, Judge Patel made her ruling right from the bench.
I decided beforehand that the people had come for a reason, and they deserved some kind of a response from the court.
And she issued her ruling, in essence stating that there was sufficient evidence of governmental misconduct, of suppression of evidence, and that the policies of the American government were infected with racism.
And when she finished and just got up and left, walked out of the courtroom, the audience literally was stunned.
I turned to Fred, and Fred looked at me and said, "What happened?" And I said, "Fred, you won. Your conviction's thrown out. You won." And Fred looked at me in a very subdued way. I think he was a little stunned, and he said, "That's good. That's really good."
And I just couldn't believe it. It took me quite a while before I actually sunk in that I have won.
We understood when we first took this case that by attacking the conviction under the vehicle we were using, we could not overturn the actual Supreme Court ruling that was rendered in 1944. That was our greatest hope, but we could not find a legal vehicle to do so. So the Supreme Court precedent still stands as a legal precedent.
The principle that you can single out people on the basis of their race, their ancestry, I think is the principle that is so dangerous, so subversive to our Constitution.
It may help some people to go, wait a minute, what's going on in America right now? Are we inadvertently and in an unconscious way perpetrating a similar abuse against another group?
There was discussion that if any American prisoners were taken in the war, in Desert Storm, that there would be a roundup of Iraqis as a trade-off of POWs.
2 years ago, I spoke at the University of Michigan, and we were going through there with the group of us, and all of a sudden, there was another group, students came from the other end, about 15 of them, and they surrounded me and said, "Fred, we appreciate what you've been doing." And they gave me a certificate, and it was the Arab students of Michigan.
Today, Fred Korematsu is seen as a hero, as he should be.
Fred was the ordinary person who at a time of great crisis rises to extraordinary heights.
Fred reminded me very much of somebody else, and that's Rosa Parks, the woman who refused to sit in the back of a bus in Birmingham, Alabama. And it's ordinary people like that just making a stand. And it's usually something very simple, like going to work. Fred wanted to stay in his home. That's all he wanted to do. And it's the right that every American has. But it's that kind of person, ordinary people who do extraordinary things, that really shape our history.
In the long history of our country's constant search for justice, some names of ordinary citizens stand for millions of souls. Plessy, Brown, Parks. To that distinguished list, today we add the name of Fred Korematsu.
Our next guest is a psychotherapist and guest lecturer in the Department of American Culture at the University of Michigan. He will present the legacy and lessons of Fred Korematsu. Please welcome Mr. Ron Aramaki.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank, first of all, Principal Moranconi, Assistant Principal Dan Easthouse, the faculty and staff, and the distinguished guests for being here to really lend their presence to make this a very special and important occasion. I want to recognize all the students for coming here today, and also want to acknowledge you for being here, and hope that this makes an impression on you. If not today, then sometime later on in your lives when you become civic leaders, attorneys, justices, members of Congress, presidents of the United States. It's an honor here to recognize a true civil rights hero. As you saw in the video, the Fred Korematsu story, it's a compelling lesson in history and civil rights. And it's also a cautionary tale of what we need to be aware of, not from the past, but also for today. As in the video, we saw how he was arrested, convicted, sent to a camp, and his conviction was taken all the way up to the Supreme Court. And again, as you saw, the Supreme Court in a 6-3 decision voted against him. It declared that the incarceration was not caused by racism, but it was justified under the military's claim for military necessity. And again, the convictions of Fred and two other people, Min Yasui, Gordon Hirabayashi, stood for over 40 years. What are the lessons? Well, first of all, what are the lessons and the legacy of Fred Korematsu? The first and foremost one is to know your history and question it. Like Karen Korematsu, I did not know about the World War II camps until I was in high school, probably about the same time frame as Karen. In Salt Lake City, there were a lot of Japanese Americans. There were two churches, a Buddhist church and a Christian church. There were two chapters of the Japanese American Citizens League, and nearly every Nisei was involved and active in a bowling league. You learn a lot from people when you're in a bowling alley and you hang out there. I was astonished when I talked to these people that I learned that there were some people who were in Topaz, did not go back to California, but ended up relocating in Salt Lake City. So I asked them, how did this happen? What could have been done about it? And nearly every person said the same thing. I don't want to talk about it. Don't bring it up. This is the effect that the military and the war have on the psyches of Japanese Americans that lasted for nearly 40 years. So it's important that you, as students, as individuals, ask questions. Ask questions about the effects of stereotyping on people, you as an individual, a group that you might be representing, whether you want it to be or not. And keep persisting in asking those kinds of questions. When you get pushback from people that are uncomfortable, you know that you hit onto something. The second important lesson is to look for patterns of social and political injustice and speak to the importance of learning from the past. As we saw, Fred did not rest on his Supreme Court overturning, his case being overturned in 1983. After 9/11, he filed two briefs, Friends of the Court briefs, to the Supreme Court, basically stating that his case could be used against other people as well, post 9/11. His example of challenging the practices of oppression, hysteria, and prejudice are still important today. The American Citizens for Justice looked to prosecute the killers of Vincent Chin on the grounds of violating his civil rights. The two men were eventually found not guilty, but the victim impact statements in court is now regular practice. The school bullying cases against Asian Americans in Philadelphia, Salt Lake City, and other places call for educating students and teachers to prevent that type of bullying and stereotyping. We need to support victims of bullying and denounce the aggression that's behind it. The passage of the National Defense Authorization Act, passed by our president, which would allow the government to detain without trial Americans who may be a security threat, is a chilling reminder of our past. So then, what is the legacy of Fred Korematsu? Fred's legacy is that of standing up for his rights and setting straight a past grievance against 110,000 Japanese Americans. His legacy as a civil rights hero inspires us to stand up for others when their civil rights are violated because of differences of race, color, or gender. I remember Fred as a humble, simple man with a strong conviction for justice. As Roland said, he spoke to our class every year, and it was just a thrilling thing for me and for our students to be able to talk to a living person of history. If Fred were here to deliver a message to you today, I believe it would be that regardless of your own comfort zone, you have a responsibility to speak up for others. Again, you may not experience or appreciate how important this is. It's the place that you come here to learn history. I think that the more that it's repeated, the more that you understand it. As many things in our experiences, the more we hear them, the more that we incorporate them into our own lives. This is the third year commemorating Fred Korematsu Day in Michigan. This is also the second year that Troy High School has sponsored this event. It's really grown and become a large, important issue since the first time, and I want to acknowledge that as well. Again, I'd like to thank all of you for allowing me the privilege to speak on behalf of Fred Korematsu, his role, his personal life as a true civil rights hero. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Aramaki. Our next speaker is a former attorney and ex-detainee of the Rower, Arkansas internment camp. She will give us some reflections on experiences in the Rower, Arkansas internment camp. Let's give her a warm welcome, Mrs. Mary Comedoy.
When the war started, December 7, 1941, I was living in the northern part of California where all the Japanese people lived. That was known as the agricultural country of California. I was 11 years old, and on a Sunday when the family was all together, my brother was listening to the radio and he told us that there was a war that was started by Japan. My father looked at him and said, "No, I think you've heard it wrong. Japan would never do such a horrible thing." But as the days went by, or the hours went by on Sunday, our relatives and friends were calling everybody on the phone because they really didn't believe that this had happened. So when my uncle called my father up and told him, then my father said to us, he said, "You know, your mother and I are not citizens of the U.S., so we don't know what's going to happen to us. But whatever happens, I want you children to all stay together and be a family." This is one thing that I have really hesitated in saying, because that was one thing that has remained in my mind, and I could just see our family still sitting around this table. And so when, as the days went by, my parents always said, "We're going to continue living like we have, so you children have to get up and go to school." But as the days went by, the children that we had as classmates started to frown on us being in the same school. And they were treating us so mean that all of us kids would go home and tell our parents, and our parents wouldn't insist that we went to school after that. So we had missed a lot of our schooling in a short time that we didn't go. And so finally, in February, when we had the Executive Order 9066, then we had a curfew. So our school was much further than 5 miles away, so us children that lived over 5 miles could not go to school. By April, we were told that we would be taken out of our homes and sent to a camp. And so my first camp was the Assembly Center, which was about 2.5 miles from our home. And it was where the horses were kept for the horse races. When we got there, we were told that this is where we were going to live. And I'm thinking to myself, gee, you know, there was nothing in the stables but hay. So what every family got that was stuck in the horse stables with a bale of hay, we had to scatter it around, and that's what our floor was. By August of the year, we were sent to another camp, which would be a permanent camp in Roar, Arkansas, which it seemed unusual because all the other camps were built on the West Coast area. So when we were told that we would go to the Roar camp, they told us that we had to pack only what we can carry, no more. And so we got on this train, and it took us 4.5 days to get to Arkansas from California. When we got there, we saw all these barracks, and that was going to be our home for the time being. And so our leaders of the community always asked the ad people, the administrative people, how long we would be here. But nobody knew, and I don't think they even knew. So we did live in the camp for 3 years. And after, when the camp started to close, really the Issei's had nowhere to go. So word of mouth, people just said, well, okay, if you're going there, maybe we'll go also. Because now we all felt that there was more safety in numbers. So many of the people from the Roar camp came to Detroit. And when they came to Detroit, again, they could not live where they wanted to, so they all congregated in the Cass Corridor area, because Cass Corridor had so many apartment houses. And they had to live with each other. And I guess at that time, there was no such law as you can't have 3 or 4 families living in one apartment. But that was the best they could do, or else the younger people had to go to the YMCAs or YWCAs. And for jobs, the Issei's were already over the age of finding jobs, so the Issei's decided, well, they would take any job they could take just to earn a living and to get on our feet. So most of the young people became houseboys, they became taxi drivers, they did work at the DSR bus stations, and the girls were all maids in the wealthy homes here in Detroit. So actually, now that the Issei's have gotten on their feet, I've always said to all my friends, do you tell your children about this experience we've had? And they said no, because they themselves were so ashamed of the lifestyle that we led. And I said, but you know, your children should be told this because it's such an important part of your life. But because of being so ashamed, the third generation, the Sanseis, know very little about camp life or what happened to them. And also, the fourth generation, I don't think knows anything about our experiences, which I think is such a big mistake for parents not to tell their children. But of course, you know, I've had parents say to me, well, you probably feel that way because you don't have any children. But I don't want my kids to know that I lived in poverty level when I left camp. And I said, well, I don't think, I said, that's anything to be ashamed of. But you know, we had always been brought up, and one of the most important things in our culture is not to shame your family. We have to go along with the flow. And we have a word in the Japanese language, gaman, which means you do whatever you have to do and do it with dignity so that you do not embarrass your people. And we've always lived by that rule. And so finally, when 1970 came along, our national officers decided they would try to get reparation for the Issei's, which was our parents. but all the bills that they processed fell through. And finally, when the Sanseis started becoming attorneys, they thought that was so wrong of their parents to have to live that way. So they took over and they started these bills, and you've seen many of them interviewed on Korematsu film. And so finally, their bills did not go through. So luckily, our community had a friend. They had two friends in DC, Senator Daniel Inouye and Senator Spark Matsunaga. They felt it was so wrong, so they both processed a bill that was called an entitlement bill, which is similar to our Social Security bill. And that bill was passed. And the commission that Carter had appointed to study the causes of us being evacuated, they came up with the line that the only reason they could find was because of discrimination, war hysteria, and poor leadership. So they felt that the government should reimburse the Issei's for all their losses. So the government finally decided they would give us reparation of $20,000 per surviving internee. And we felt very bad about it, the Issei's, because we really wanted to see our parents collect the money before they died. But by the time they started handing out the redress, about 90% of the Issei's were already gone. So, and after we had gotten the redress, we had heard a lot of flack, the American people, that we were not entitled to this. There were a lot of newspaper articles in the Free Press and the Detroit News. And also, when I started working at Ford Motor Company, I had a lot of flack thrown at me because I should go home where I came from, because nobody knew that I was born and raised in California and I had been an American citizen. So all along, it's been a long struggle for us Issei's, and I don't feel that, we've done anything wrong, and it's too bad that our Sanseis and the Yonseis do not know about our background during the war. So, our parents had always told us that if you have a will to do anything, you can get anything done, so don't ever give up. And that's the rule that all the Issei's have lived by. And so today, I think the Issei's have done very well for themselves. But one mistake that I see that's being made among my friends as well as my family members, because the Issei's struggled along with the Issei's and we had nothing, now they are just overloading their children with whatever they want. And I've always said to my own family members, I have 9 sisters and brothers that have children, and I always said to them, that's not teaching your children anything. They should go through a few things of hardship so they would know that life is not always a bed of roses. But they always looked at me like, oh yeah, because you don't have kids, you can say that. But that's not the reason why I say that, because I believe in it. You can give, and never teach the children what hardships you might run into when you get on your own. So that's always been our rule among the Issei's and the Issei's, that we have to live and do the things we have to do, because you can survive if you try hard enough. And that's the way it was with us.
Thank you, Mary Komodoy. Our last speaker is a contributor to NBC News Asian America, and she's going to talk about what Fred Korematsu means to us today. And we have about 5 minutes or so, and then Mr. Ronconi is going to make a close. Please welcome Francis Wang.
Some people think that the incarceration of Japanese Americans in concentration camps during World War II happened a long, long time ago. And since the verdict in the Korematsu case was vacated, everything's okay now. And this could never happen again. However, after the events of 9/11, there has been an escalation of hate crimes and racial profiling in our country, 1,600%, targeting Muslims and Arab Americans and those perceived as Muslim and Arab Americans, like Sikh Americans, for whom 2 out of 3 children who wear patak or turbans are bullied in schools. In fact, the first person killed in a hate crime after 9/11 was a Sikh American, originally from India, named Balbir Singh Sodhi. There were also many people at the time proposing that we round up all the Muslim and Arab Americans into concentration camps, just like World War II. They thought that'd be a good idea. Luckily, many Japanese Americans, including Fred Korematsu, stood up for the Muslim and Arab American communities and said, never again. So it is important to continue to examine the Korematsu case as we look to the future, our future. This was part of Fred Korematsu's motivation for forcing the U.S. Supreme Court to re-examine the case, to stand up for what is right and ensure that this does not happen to anyone else ever again. It is important for all of us to also look out for each other and to stand up for our friends and our neighbors. We should fight against all forms of ignorance and bigotry because although the target might change, in the 1940s, it was Japanese Americans. In the 60s, African Americans. In the 80s, Asian Americans. Today, it's Muslims and Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, as well as Hispanic Americans. Tomorrow, it might be any one of us. And frankly, races are not that good at telling us all apart. Another problem is that what sets them off is always something called suspicious activity, which is a code so subjective as to cover almost anything that we do. After 9/11, for example, every time a group of Indian or Pakistani families got together for a potluck, some neighbor would see all these brown people walking into a house with big pots of chicken curry and call the FBI to report suspicious activity. After the Boston bombings, a Saudi student at MSU named Tahal al-Roki went to a potluck, bringing his food in a pressure cooker, and someone called the FBI to investigate his kapsa, a dish made with rice and meat. Very suspicious. Sometimes racist and sexist slurs bubble out far too easily, revealing the distance between us. A year and a half ago, a group of Vietnamese American students who attended a University of Michigan game in Lansing were all dressed in maize and blue for the annual UM-MSU game. They were heckled and harassed, not only for being U of M fans, which they expected on the MSU campus, but also for being Asian. And not just from MSU students, but from other U of M students as well. We need to get to know each other better so that we can see each other for who we are, not some vague stereotype and even vaguer fear of the unknown. We all remember the Trayvon Martin case, but closer to home, in Dearborn, a year ago November, a 19-year-old African-American woman named Renisha McBride had a car accident during the night and knocked on the door of a nearby house to get help. The Caucasian homeowner was so frightened, he responded by opening his front door and shooting her in the face with a shotgun and killing her. He said he thought she was trying to break into his house. The community stood up and said, this could have been any one of us. Theodore Wafer was sentenced to 17 to 32 years in prison. Now remember, there's no one way for standing up for what is right. Any one of us can do this in our own way. Do we have any artists and writers here? After the attacks at Charlie Hebdo in Paris earlier this month, where 17 people were tragically killed by terrorists, there has been a spike in Islamophobic acts and threats around the world. In San Francisco, an extremist anti-Muslim hate group purchased 50 inflammatory ads on San Francisco Muni buses equating Islam with Nazism. City leaders in Muni could do nothing to stop the anti-Muslim ads because of freedom of speech issues. Then, this past weekend, on Sunday, a young street artists, a group of them, stepped in to challenge the ads by adding triumphant images of comic book superhero Ms. Marvel, also known as Muslim Pakistani American shape-shifting teenager Kamala Khan, to the ads on the buses, alongside new messages, including calling all bigotry busters, stamp out racism, free speech isn't a license to spread hate, and Islamophobia hurts us all, complete with red hearts for punctuation. Love and creativity are much more powerful than hate and fear. Fred Korematsu wasn't much older than you when he resisted the order to be interned. At the time, he says he just wanted to live his life, but then he also realized that it was important to fight for what is right. Other second-generation Japanese American men age 18 and up, also not much older than you, volunteered for the U.S. military, the celebrated 442nd Regimental Combat Team and 100th Infantry Battalion, the two most decorated military units in U.S. history, in order to prove their loyalty and the loyalty of their families. Unfortunately, some of the racist fears behind the Japanese internment during World War II still exist in our society, in our state, in our schools, and it is important for all of us to take the time to get to know each other, to stand up for each other, and to speak out when we see prejudice and injustice. This is for all of us. As Fred Korematsu said, if you have the feeling that something is wrong, don't be afraid to speak up. Stand up for what is right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we're short on time here, but if we could give a round of applause for all of our speakers again here today. And again, thank you to Jen Hilsinger and Roland Huang and Mr. House for coordinating this event. I hope you found it to be as powerful and important as a message as I have. And in 2 years, to see it go from a presentation to 100 to a presentation of a full auditorium, it definitely is inspiring. So hopefully you take this message you've enjoyed today. Thank you for coming. Have a great day.